Hi, I'm Steve Bainbridge, and I teach corporate law at the UCLA School of Law. Welcome to another ProfessorBainbridge.com video presentation. Today I'll be talking about the parable of the talents, but I'll be looking at it from a somewhat unusual perspective. I'll be focusing on the legal and economic principles that are implicit in the parable. Please like and subscribe. This project lies at the intersection of my professional and personal interests in theology, business law, and economics. Now, why bother with a project like this? First, studying ancient texts, including religious ones, can provide insights into legal history. We don't know very much, for example, about the fiduciary duties of agents under first century Jewish law, for example. Studying biblical passages, especially the parables of Jesus, can shed light on such questions. Second, studying Judeo-Christian texts can help shed light on our modern law. And certainly those of you who are familiar with fiduciary law know that it needs as much light as can be brought to bear. Duke Law professor Deborah DeMott has aptly described fiduciary law as one of the most elusive concepts in Anglo-American legal jurisprudence. Third, studying religious texts has potential as a way of nailing down some of these concepts is particularly apt to fiduciary law, even more so than most areas of the law, because fiduciary law is founded in broad notions of justice and morality. It's often been said, for example, that the fiduciary duty of loyalty is based on the biblical proposition that no one can serve two masters. Now, why study parables in particular? Well, parables were one of Jesus's most preferred teaching tools. He used them to eliminate the problem of expressing supernatural concepts in natural language. The goal of Jesus' parables was to stimulate thought, encourage people to think for themselves, and thus to puzzle out religious mysteries. In order to facilitate that process, the parable was told as though it were a true story, even if sometimes a highly improbable one, which allowed the listeners to accept it as a factual basis from which to extrapolate theological lessons. The parable of the talents, thus, was likely based on a legal backstory about the fiduciary duties of servants that would have been well understood by those who heard the parable. And in turn, that permits us to draw inferences about the contents of that background law. Now, the New Testament contains two versions of the parable, which were likely taught at different times in Jesus' ministry. Matthew's version was part of an eschatological sermon, while Luke's version was taught by Jesus to his disciples as they traveled to Jerusalem for the Last Supper. Both versions, of course, offer the same basic story with four key plot elements. First, a master is leaving on a long trip and entrusts substantial assets to three servants to manage during his absence. Two of the servants invested the assets profitably, earning substantial returns. But a third servant, frightened of his master's reputation as a hard taskmaster, put the money away for safekeeping and failed even to earn interest on it. Third, the master returns and demands an accounting from the servants. Fourth, the two servants who invested wisely are praised and rewarded, but the servant who failed to do so is condemned, criticized, and punished. The basic theological lesson that Jesus presumably intended his hearers to grasp is that they are to labor diligently in the service of the kingdom of God. Jesus' followers were not to hide their light under the proverbial bushel, but rather to use their talents to the fullest extent of their abilities to fulfill the Great Commission. Now, why do I assume that Jesus would have had at least a rough working knowledge of the legal principles that would have governed the relationship of the master and his servants in the parable? Well, we often assume that Jesus was poor, especially during his ministry. But in fact, we know very little about Jesus' life uh, between the time that he went to the temple with his parents at about age 12 and the time that he began his ministry at around age 30. But presumably, Jesus worked with his earthly father, Joseph, as a carpenter and tradesman. And we know that in general, the income of carpenters and similar trades workers during the relevant time period were substantially above the subsistence level. While it's certainly unlikely that Jesus was wealthy or that his family was wealthy, it's almost certainly the case that Jesus, along with his family, participated in economic life and likely was what today we might think of as working class or maybe even lower middle class. And as such, he probably would have had working familiarity with the commercial norms and legal standards of the day. So let's turn to the parable now. The initial question, I suppose, is whether or not the servants were free agents or slaves. In contrast to the extensive code of religious law that can be found in the Old Testament, there's little direct evidence in either testament for the content of Jewish civil law during the relevant time period. It seems likely, however, that the civil law kept developing according to the life conditions, usages, and rules of conduct of the age, adapting and evolving to take usages as they developed and to reflect changing economic patterns, changing economic needs. And in particular, it seems likely that Jewish civil law was heavily influenced by first Greek and then Roman civil law. The question to be addressed then is whether we can draw inferences from the parable about one civil law issue, namely the fiduciary duties of agents. Let's start with the question of whether it's reasonable to view the servants as agents. Now, some scholars contend that the servants of the parable were slaves, but even if that's true, that would not necessarily be dispositive of our question. According to Justice Story, a slave, in fact, could serve as an agent under Roman civil law. And in the parable, the servants are clearly serving as the master's financial agents, whether they were free or slave. And in any case, other scholars who have studied the parable have concluded that they, in fact, were not slaves, but rather were free agents of the master. Either way, it seems safe to assume that the servants would have been regarded, just as they would today, as fiduciaries of the master and have fiduciary duties to the master. But what are those fiduciary duties? Justice Felix Frankfurter famously remarked that to say that a person is a fiduciary only begins the analysis. It gives direction to further inquiry. And it requires you to ask a series of questions. To whom is this person a fiduciary? What obligations does this person owe as a fiduciary? In what respect, if any, has this person failed to comply with those obligations? And what are the consequences of that person's deviation from his fiduciary obligations? Now, as we consider the parable, one question that immediately presents itself is whether the legal system of first century Israel limited fiduciary obligations to merely proscriptive, or whether they included both proscriptive and prescriptive fiduciary obligations. In the United Kingdom, for example, the fiduciary duties of an agent are limited to a prohibition on the agent making an unauthorized profit. The agent may not have a personal interest in the subject matter of the agency. The agent may not put his or her personal interests ahead of the interest rather of the principal. Beyond that rather minimal obligation, however, there is no positive duty in UK jurisprudence for an agent to affirmatively act in the interests of the person to whom the duties are owed. In the United States, by way of contrast, in addition to a prescriptive ban on self-dealing on the part of an agent, the agent has an affirmative, prescriptive obligation to act in the best interests of the principal. In corporate law, for example, the duties of directors and officers require them to maximize the wealth of shareholders. And so agents under UK law, while not required to do so, agents under US law are required to make sure that in representing the principal and carrying out tasks for the principal, that they maximize the benefits the principal receives from their activities. I think we can infer that the fiduciary duties that Jesus and his listeners thought would apply to the servants in the parable were more closely akin to that of modern American law than to that of British law, that it included both proscriptive but also prescriptive duties. And if you think about the master's reaction, particularly to the third servant, it seems clear that the master believes that his servants had an affirmative obligation to advance his best interests. In particular, the master evidently believed that his servants had a duty not only to preserve the funds with which they had been entrusted, but to affirmatively deploy them in trade or investing so as to increase their value. Now, at this point, we do reach an interesting wrinkle in the two parables. In Matthew's parable, the bad servant, the unfaithful servant, buried the master's talent in the ground in order to protect it. In contrast, in Luke's version, the unfaithful servant hid the monies with which he had been entrusted in a piece of cloth. Now, according to some scholars, Jewish law of the period would have treated the latter, wrapping them in cloth, much more severely than the former, burying them. Excuse me. As one commentator remarks, burying was regarded as the best security against theft. If a person entrusted with money buried it as soon as he took possession of it, he would be free from liability should anything happen to it. For money merely tied up in a cloth, the opposite was true. In that case, the person was responsible to cover any loss any loss incurred due to the irresponsible nature of his conduct. I speculate that presumably a treasurer that's carefully buried was regarded as being less susceptible to theft or damage than one that was simply wrapped up in a cloth and left who knows where. But interestingly, in the two parables, the servant in Matthew, who did what apparently was regarded under Jewish law as the preferred method of protecting your master's wealth, is much more severely punished than the servant in Luke, who took the less desirable way of protecting the master's wealth. And that has a lot of implications and allows us to draw a lot of interesting inferences as we contemplate that critical distinction. Why did Jesus introduce this wrinkle in the way the two parables were taught? And in particular, why did he introduce in Matthew's parable the idea that even though the unfaithful servant had done what in Jewish law at the time was presumably the preferred method of safeguarding the master's assets, that servant is much more severely condemned and much more severely treated? Perhaps Jesus introduced this twist to grab his audience's attention and thereby drive home the message that there are going to be serious consequences for those of his followers who fail to use their talents in the service of the kingdom of God. The placement in Matthew of the parable is, I think, particularly pertinent to that possibility. The Matthew's version of the parable of the talents is situated immediately before the famous parable of the sheep and the goats. You recall that in that parable, Jesus separates at the end time humanity into goats and sheep. And he says to the goats, you didn't feed me, you didn't clothe me, you didn't visit me in prison. And the goats say, well, Lord, when did we ever see you in prison, hungry, naked? And Jesus says, when you failed to do that for the least of my people, you failed to do it for me. And he says to the sheep, good and faithful servants, you fed me, you clothed me, you visited me in prison. And they say, well, when did we see you naked? When did we see you hungry? When did we see you in prison? And he said, whenever you did that for the least of my people, you did it as though it was for me. And so there's this sense of we're obliged to use our full talent, if you will, in the service of the poor, in the service of the downtrodden, in the service of those who are oppressed and imprisoned. And the harsh treatment of the unfaithful servant would have been a way of driving that lesson home. Yet, again, I come back to the idea that very often Jesus's parables were premised on a secular account, a secular backstory that would have been familiar to his listeners and that would have helped them to understand the point. And so there may well be a secular explanation of what's going on here. In first century Judea and Galilee, Roman rule was facilitating a shift from an agrarian economy in which reciprocity was the dominant form of exchange to a more market-oriented economy in which trading was becoming much more dominant. Luke's version of the story makes sense in the older agrarian economy, where protecting the value of assets one already owned would have seemed more important and more socially responsible than trying to increase their value. In the new, increasingly market-oriented economy, where the supply of goods is no longer fixed and trade was facilitated by the increasing use of money as a unit of exchange rather than barter, trade was no longer a zero-sum game. Instead, it could produce surplus wealth that came from wealth creation rather than wealth transfers. Matthew's version of the story presumably reflects the expectation of a master operating in this new environment who expects his servant to do more than simply protect the value of the master's assets, but expects the servant to deploy those assets in a productive way. Reversing the old expectations about which servant would be punished more severely, thus may have been in line with changing social and economic norms and reflected that backstory. If the parable, in fact, reflects changing norms, adapting to a changing economy, several aspects of the parable begin to make sense. First, it explains the reliance by the master on agents to conduct financial affairs. A non-commercial society, while it might have much use for servants, would have little need for agents who would be empowered to represent the principal in business dealings with third persons, as these servants clearly were. An emerging commercial society, by way of contrast, would have needed precisely the sort of servant agents we see here who could conduct trade on the master's behalf. Second, as we've seen, it helps explain why the master expected his servants not only to preserve his assets, but also to use them to earn him more money. What it doesn't explain is why the law would give that expectation effect. Put another way, it doesn't explain the Jewish law's decision to adopt both prescriptive and proscriptive rules. After all, countries that at least claim to have a purely proscriptive understanding of an agent's fiduciary duties, Australia, the United Kingdom, a number of other British Commonwealth countries, have active trading and commercial economies. Nevertheless, I think that in this regard, thinking about the parable and the changing economic and social norms that may underlie Matthew's version in particular helps us understand why legal systems very often tend towards the prescriptive model. The master in the parable had very definite expectation that his servants would do more than simply avoid conflicts of interest. He had an expectation that they would affirmatively deploy those resources to increase his wealth. And I suspect the same is true of most masters, even today. Secondly, as the UK example suggests, prescriptive duties are often enforced by contract. Masters and servants, principals and agents, even in systems like the UK or Australia, often want precisely this obligation that the agent act in ways that are designed to increase the principal's wealth. They do so by contract rather than by legal obligation. But the parable suggests that imposing prescriptively such an obligation as the default rule makes a certain amount of sense, and probably made even more sense in first century Judea and Galilee than it makes today. No contract of any degree of complexity is ever a fully complete, fully realized document. The familiar triad of contracting problems, uncertainty, complexity, and opportunism, precludes principals and agents from entering into complete contracts that fully specify the agent's obligations under all conditions. When you add in the communication difficulties that would have been inherent in first century technology, the master cannot draft a contract that covers all the contingencies that might arise while he's away. And if an unexpected contingency arises, the agent can't contact the master to find out what the master wants done. The agent is going to have to exercise discretion. And in order to ensure that the agent exercises that discretion accountably, it makes sense for the law to impose a duty that says, okay, you should make the decision that, in your best judgment, maximizes the master's wealth, rather than simply protecting it. The other twist that the Matthean version of the story introduces is the rather harsh sanction to which the unfaithful servant is subjected. This likely shocks many modern readers. And indeed, it so shocks some scholars that they have called into question the authenticity of the parable as a teaching of the historical Jesus. Jesus's emphasis on mercy and the interests of the poor and so on is said to be inconsistent with the gist of this parable. Richly rewarding entrepreneurial servants while harshly punishing one who was frightened does seem, at least superficially, out of character for Jesus. This is, after all, the same Jesus who drove the money changers out of his father's temple. The same Jesus who usually was so concerned with the plight of the poor and the downtrodden. Assuming we are correct in interpreting the parable as an allegory intended to prompt total commitment to the service of the kingdom of God, the sanctions begin to make more sense. Again, remember that the Matthew's version is situated immediately prior to the sheep and the goats. And the goats in the latter parable meet a similarly harsh sanction. The punishment the servant receives in the parable of the talents in Matthew's version may have been intended to drive that point home. That when you fail to use your talents in service of the kingdom of God, you are placing in jeopardy your eternal destiny. But again, what's interesting to me is that the parable also makes sense from an economic perspective. Professor Tamar Frankel, one of our leading students and scholars of fiduciary duty law, identifies a number of situations in which remedies for breach of fiduciary duty must be what she calls strict. Typically, in such cases, the amount entrusted to the agent is high. The principal's ability to supervise and control the agent is low, and the discretion possessed by the agent is high. Well, that's precisely our story in the parable. A talent represented 26 kilograms of silver and was worth about 6,000 denarii. The annual pay of a Roman legionnaire was 225 denarii. So you could pay almost 30 Roman legionnaires for a year with a talent. That's a substantial amount of money to entrust to someone. In addition, the master was on a long journey. As we've already mentioned, first century communication technology was not very good, was an era of very slow communications. And so the master's ability to supervise and control the agents is extremely limited. And finally, the agents have been left with essentially no instructions. Just here's some money. Do something with it. They were vested with a high amount of discretion. And those are precisely Professor Frankel's conditions for at least strict sanctions. And so again, the thing that I find so interesting about the parable is the way that it meshes with modern economic and legal realities. In sum, the parable of the talents proves to have a rich legal backstory. Exploring that backstory has shed light both on our understanding of first century Jewish civil law and provided an opportunity to reflect on current legal issues. Despite the 2 millennia that separate us from the parable's first hearers, we see that agency-type relationships have the same basic structures and the same basic flaws, regardless of time and place, and have elicited very similar legal rules to deal with those flaws. So we can see that Jesus's teaching was premised on the same sort of legal norms as those provided by modern American agency law, suggesting that societies widely separated in time developed similar bodies of law to govern these sort of relationships. This talk has been based on my essay on the parable of the talents, which was published in a 2018 research handbook that was edited by Gordon Smith and Andrew Gold and published by the Edward Elgar Publishing Company. And you can buy that volume on Amazon. It's not cheap, I have to admit, but it's a collection of excellent essays on a wide range of fiduciary duty topics in a number of different legal contexts. I'd also encourage you to visit my blog, www.professorbainbridge.com. Visit my Twitter feed at Prof. Bainbridge. And if you would, please like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much.